Version of your story, rewritten for a 20-minute YouTube video format. It uses simple, clear English, strong atmosphere, and hooks designed for an American audience interested in dark history and horror. This is part one of your story. Low, ominous tones.
Narrator!
Calm, eerie voice. Dead of winter, 1879, contractors arrived at the old Sunset Years Christian home in Hartford, Connecticut, to begin renovations on what was once a peaceful retirement home for the elderly. But what they found under the floorboards of the medical wing would haunt the city for generations. Wrapped in crumbling burial shrouds, hidden in the shadows for decades, were 23 leather-bound ledgers, records so detailed, so cold, so horrifying, that even hardened investigators couldn't believe what they were reading. These weren't medical notes or financial logs. They were the written confessions of systematic murder. Each page listed a name, a date, the method of killing, and the inheritance collected afterward. Over $3 million, stolen from nearly 200 elderly victims, and all of it hidden behind the pure white walls of a home that claimed to be run on Christian love. This is the story of Dr. William Porter, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah, a family of respected caregivers who, behind closed doors, turned compassion into cruelty and religion into a mask for murder. But before we dive deeper into their twisted world, if you're still watching, then you're not like most people. Most people turn away from stories like this, but not you. You're here because you want to know the truth, the hidden, dark truth that polite history tries to forget. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Click that notification bell and let us know in the comments what city or state you're listening from. We want to know how far the truth travels. Now, let's go back. All the way back to Hartford, Connecticut in the year 1845. Scene transition music, subtle melancholic piano. Back then, Hartford was a city in transition. The old Puritan ways were fading and the new industrial world was taking over. The city's elite, wealthy merchants and retired sea captains were growing older, but their families were moving west, chasing land and gold, leaving their aging parents behind. These elderly folks had money, but no one to care for them. That's when a man named Dr. William Porter stepped forward. A tall, striking man with silver hair and intense blue eyes. Porter was a respected doctor who had studied at Yale, served as a field surgeon during the Mexican-American War. He returned from the battlefield not just with medical skills, but with an intimate understanding of life and death. His wife, Margaret, was a nurse with years of experience in Boston's charity hospitals. Her sister Sarah, recently widowed, had devoted her life to Christian service. Together, they seemed like angels sent from heaven. And in 1845, they opened the Sunset Years Christian Home, a beautiful Victorian mansion on Prospect Avenue, surrounded by gardens and even a small chapel for daily prayer. It wasn't just a retirement home. It was marketed as a Christian sanctuary for the final years of life, a place where the wealthy elderly could find peace, prayer, and purpose. For $200 a month, a small fortune in those days, residents were promised dignity, comfort, and eternal readiness. Soon the home was full. Even Reverend Samuel Whitmore, pastor of Hartford's largest church, personally recommended the Porters to his congregation. And what made the home even more attractive, they accepted everyone, even those with mental decline, dementia, confusion, isolation. Other homes turned those people away, but not the Porters. Dr. Porter said he had created a new treatment, a mix of modern medicine and daily prayer. To families overwhelmed with guilt and grief, it sounded like a miracle. Shift in tone, subtle background tension builds. The daily life at Sunset Years Christian Home looked perfect on the surface. Morning prayers at 6 a.m., breakfast in the dining hall, Bible study and garden walks in the afternoon. Evening hymns before bed. Dr. Porter conducted daily checkups. Margaret oversaw the nurses. Sarah handled finances and supplies. Visitors praised the home's cleanliness, the kindness of the staff, and the calm atmosphere. Everyone seemed so content. But behind every smile was a plan. Behind every prayer was a lie. Because from the very beginning, the Porters were never interested in simply caring for the elderly. They were building the perfect trap, a place where the vulnerable, the isolated and the forgotten could be quietly disposed of. And their fortunes transferred directly to the Porters. Darker music enters. The first death happened in February of 1847. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a 73-year-old widow, had just moved into the home 3 weeks earlier. She was in good health, lonely, yes, with some arthritis, but nothing serious. Her husband had died, her daughter lived far away in California, and her son had recently died in an accident. She was alone, but wealthy. Her estate was worth nearly $50,000, an enormous sum for the time. That morning, Margaret found Mrs. Thornton nearly unconscious in bed, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide and unseeing. She mumbled about angels and said they were coming to take her away. Dr. Porter arrived and claimed she was experiencing rapid mental decline, something he said he had seen before. He prescribed morphine, a heavy dose, to ease her suffering, he said. Christian mercy, he called it. Margaret administered the injection herself. For 3 days, the Porters sat at her side, holding her hand, whispering prayers. Staff and visitors were told she was fading naturally, that death was coming peacefully, that her soul was being prepared for the next world. On the 4th day, Mrs. Thornton died. The official record listed the cause of death as natural decline. She was buried quietly, and no one ever questioned a thing. Reflective music, slow. What no one knew, not then, was that this was just the beginning. In the years that followed, more residents would show the same symptoms: sudden confusion, sleepiness, strange talk of angels and dreams, then the morphine, then the prayers, then death. Each time, the Porters documented everything, every name, every dose, every estate, and when those ledgers were finally found in 1879, buried under the floor, stained with age and something darker, the count stood at 189 confirmed deaths. And $3 million in wealth gone into the hands of the Porter family. But this is only the beginning of their story. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the Porter family's secrets, into the rituals they performed, the deals they made, and the whispers that say not all their victims left this world entirely. Some say the chapel still holds the echoes of prayers never meant for God. So stay tuned. Subscribe, comment, and share this story with those who dare to face the truth. The Sunset Years Christian Home may have closed its doors, but its ghosts never left. Part 2 of your dark historical horror story, rewritten in a simple, compelling, and atmospheric style for an American audience, and designed to last approximately 20 minutes of narration. It continues the chilling tale of the Porter family and their Christian retirement home. Opening music, dark piano chords, slow heartbeat rhythm underneath. In February of 1847, Mrs. Abigail Thornton died quietly in her bed at the Sunset Years Christian Home. Her death was listed as natural decline due to old age. Dr. William Porter, the home's attending physician and co-founder, signed the certificate himself. There was no autopsy, no questions from the city. After all, death was common in a place meant for the dying. But what happened in the days after her passing would mark the beginning of something far darker, something that would unfold in perfect silence for the next 32 years. Scene change music, gentle, somber organ playing in the background. After Mrs. Thornton's death, Sarah Porter, the doctor's sister-in-law and the home's administrator, gathered the staff. With tears in her eyes, she shared a touching story. According to Sarah, in her final hours, Mrs. Thornton had found peace. She had whispered that the care she received at the home was a gift from God. She asked that her fortune be used to continue the home's Christian mission. Sarah then presented a handwritten will, said to be dictated by Mrs. Thornton and witnessed by Dr. Porter and Margaret. It left nearly her entire estate, over $47,000, to the Sunset Years Christian Home. Only a small portion, a few $100s, was left for her daughter in California. The will was written in Sarah Porter's own handwriting, but she explained this too. Mrs. Thornton had been too weak to hold a pen, and since there was no family nearby to challenge the will, the Hartford probate court accepted it without delay. The Porters quickly liquidated Mrs. Thornton's estate. They used the money to expand the facility, add staff, and reinforce the image of their home as a shining example of Christian compassion. To anyone looking in from the outside, this was the perfect story. A lonely elderly widow dies in the care of loving Christians, and her final act is to help others live out their final days in peace. But behind that warm story was cold, calculated murder. Music fades into eerie strings. The truth, as recorded in the private ledgers, hidden beneath the floorboards, was far more disturbing. Written in Dr. Porter's own precise handwriting, the entry read, Mrs. A. Thornton, morphine overdose administered February 15, 1847. Inheritance secured $47,300. Method refined for future subjects. Gradual introduction of morphine creates appearance of natural decline. Staff suspects nothing. Community response positive. This wasn't a death. It was an experiment. Mrs. Thornton had been targeted from the moment she stepped through the door. The Porters had quietly researched her finances. They knew she had no family nearby. They knew her son had died and her daughter was far away in California. They started by giving her small, unnoticeable doses of morphine, just enough to make her seem confused, tired, a little lost. To the staff, it looked like she was just fading, mentally and physically. Then, once she was completely incapacitated, they delivered the final dose. Margaret administered it. Sarah created the forged will. Dr. Porter made the official paperwork disappear, and together they executed the first perfect murder.
Quiet piano returns, reflective of her.
But they didn't just kill Mrs. Thornton, they learned from her. They studied how the community responded, they refined their methods, they realized they had discovered something rare, the perfect crime. An elderly person dying in what looked like comfort, under the care of trusted Christian hands. No one asked questions. No one suspected murder. And no one ever looked deeper into the paperwork, the medicine, or the money. Tone darkens, strings return softly beneath voice. After Mrs. Thornton's death, the Porters changed how they ran the home. Where once they accepted anyone who could pay, now they became selective. Dr. Porter conducted long personal interviews with potential residents and their families. He said it was about tailoring care to the individual, but in reality, he was searching for vulnerabilities. Was the person wealthy? Did they have close family nearby? Were they mentally sharp? Were they likely to be missed or mourned? Margaret, now acting as the home's chief evaluator, used her nursing background to quietly assess life expectancy. She kept notes on each potential resident, who had dementia, who had heart conditions, who had distant children or no children at all. Sarah, meanwhile, became the family's expert on probate law. She studied how wills were challenged, she built relationships with local attorneys, and she learned exactly how to forge documents that would survive casual legal scrutiny. Soft background sound of typewriter keys, turning pages. Behind closed doors, the Porters were building a system, a murder machine. Dr. Porter tested new drugs, morphine, laudanum, even arsenic in low doses. He discovered combinations that made patients appear confused, weak, or simply in decline. Margaret built false medical charts, carefully noting symptoms that never existed to justify the medications. She even showed some of these fake records to visiting doctors who never questioned them. Sarah wrote wills, copied handwriting, filed legal paperwork. Together they perfected a process, and no one in Hartford suspected a thing.
Music swells slightly.
Shifting to elegant piano with a sinister... The home's reputation
soared!
They used the money they stole to make the facility even more appealing. They added a library, a music room, and expanded the gardens. They hosted charity events, inviting Hartford's most respected citizens to visit. Ministers came, wealthy donors toured the halls. Church leaders praised the Porters as a shining example of Christian love in action. Every handshake, every ribbon cutting, every hymn sung in the chapel covered the sound of death. Music fades down, silence for a beat. Behind every improvement was a stolen life. Behind every praise-filled sermon, a name crossed out in the ledger. And behind the face of Dr. Porter, his silver hair, kind smile, soft voice, was the mind of a man who no longer saw people, only targets. Closing music. Slow, ghostly piano and string. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's death was not just the first. It was the blueprint, a systematic design for murder, tested, proven, perfected. From 1847 onward, the Porters would claim 188 more lives, each one chosen with care, each one documented with surgical detail. And no one would know, not for 32 years, what really happened behind the doors of the Sunset Years Christian home. But even in those early years, a few staff members began to notice odd patterns. A few residents whispered strange things in the halls, and once, late one night, a young nurse claimed she saw something in the chapel that would change her life forever.
But that's for part 3. 3 with title and
Title: Sunset Years, A Home for the Dying, Part 2. Description: after their first successful murder, the Porters refine a system of death disguised as Christian charity. Part 3 of your historical horror story, rewritten for a 20-minute YouTube narration in a simple, engaging style tailored for an American audience. This part dives deeper into the Porters' twisted psychology and introduces the case that nearly exposed them. Mrs. Eleanor, opening music, somber strings with slow, ominous piano.
Narrator.
Soft, steady, and haunting. By the early 1850s, the Sunset Years Christian Home had become one of the most admired institutions in Hartford, Connecticut. It was praised from the pulpit, written about in glowing terms by local newspapers, and held up as a model of Christian charity. At the heart of it all were the Porters, Dr. William, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah, a holy trinity of supposed caretakers, loved by the community and trusted with the lives of the city's most vulnerable. And none sang their praises louder than Reverend Samuel Whitmore, the influential minister of First Church of Christ. From the pulpit, Reverend Whitmore regularly encouraged his wealthiest parishioners to send their elderly relatives to the Porter home, calling it a place of peace, prayer, and godly compassion. But behind the hymns and handshakes, something terrifying was growing. The Porters were no longer just killing for gain, they were perfecting it. Cue light background of eerie page-turning and quill scratching. Hidden in the ledgers beneath the floorboards, Dr. Porter had begun rating each murder like a professional critique. He listed the profit made, the elegance of the method, and the convincingness of their performance as grieving caretakers. Each entry read like a twisted case study. In one chilling page dated 1849, Dr. Porter described the slow poisoning of Colonel James Hartford, a decorated Revolutionary War veteran. The entry read, subject exhibited excellent cooperation during terminal phase. Arsenic dosage created perfect simulation of natural decline. Staff performance exemplary. Margaret's tears during final moments particularly convincing. Inheritance secured, $73,500. Overall rating, 9/10. Note, Colonel's pension ceases upon death. Factor into future calculations. They had turned murder into a business with reviews, performance scores, and financial analysis. And most terrifying of all, they believed what they were doing was righteous. They saw themselves as servants of a divine mission, using the deaths of the forgotten to fund God's work. To them, every victim was a sacrifice, a soul released to heaven, and a check written to the church on earth. Music shifts to eerie strings, soft organ undercurrents. By 1850, the Porters had everything they wanted: wealth, power, influence. They donated to charities. They sat in the front pews at church. They hosted tea parties and prayer groups for Hart's most respected families. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to show. One man in particular, Dr. Samuel Harrison, Hartford's coroner, noticed something odd. Too many death certificates were being signed by the same man, Dr. William Porter. Each death on its own seemed natural, but together the numbers didn't make sense. Then came a troubling conversation with Father Patrick O'Brien, a Catholic priest. He mentioned that some families had come to him, confused and hurt, after learning their loved ones had suddenly converted to Protestantism before death, often right before changing their wills. The Porters weren't just killing for money. They were using religion as a disguise, even targeting Catholics in a predominantly Protestant town, knowing full well that those conversions would raise less suspicion among local judges and churches. Dr. Harrison raised the alarm, but city officials told him to stand down. The Sunset Years Christian Home was one of Hartford's most prestigious institutions, and the Porters were untouchable. So the Porters did what they always did. They got ahead of the story. Scene transition music, a slow harp, light ticking. They invited Dr. Harrison for a tour of the facility. They flattered him, praised his work, and even asked for his advice on end-of-life care. It worked. By 1851, Dr. Harrison had backed off. He chalked the high death rate up to the home's willingness to take in the truly sick and mentally frail. But this close call taught the Porters something important. They were not invincible. So they adapted. They changed their routines, spread the deaths out, varied the drugs, filed more convincing medical records. They even recruited sympathetic officials, people who believed in their charity work and would look the other way. And for the next few years, things went back to normal until Steve 53. That year, a single woman would arrive at the home and bring the Porters to the edge of exposure. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. Shift to subtle tense strings, suspense builds. Mrs. Whitfield was 71 years old, a wealthy widow from Boston with signs of early dementia. She had no close family except a nephew living far away in San Francisco and an estate worth over $200,000, by far the richest prize the Porters had ever seen. She was referred to the Sunset Years Christian Home by her aging physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming. To the Porters, it was perfect. They began their process. Dr. Porter handled the medical exams. Margaret began logging false symptoms. Sarah studied her legal background. But Mrs. Whitfield had a habit no one expected. She wrote letters to herself. Every night, detailed accounts of her day, thoughts, feelings, concerns. It helped her cope with memory loss. She would read them the next morning to remember what had happened. At first, the Porters saw this as harmless, but then they read one of the letters. It said, "The medicine Dr. Porter gives me makes me feel very strange. I sleep too much. I forget simple things. Margaret watches me closely when I take it. I've seen her give it to others too, and they've all died. I wonder, is there a connection?" That sentence changed everything. Music, sharper strings now.
More intense?
Mrs. Whitfield wasn't just aware. She was documenting the crime. That the Porters panicked. Dr. Porter accelerated her drug regimen, increasing her morphine dose to silence her before she could say anything to staff. But the result was too dramatic. Mrs. Whitfield began vomiting, seizing, and slipping in and out of consciousness. Other residents began asking questions. Even the staff, usually loyal, grew uneasy. Then came the real problem. Dr. Fleming, her original physician, arrived unannounced for a surprise visit, and what he found horrified him.
Staccato piano hits, quite violin notes.
Mrs. Whitfield was near death. Pupils were dilated. Her skin was cold. Her heartbeat was erratic. She was clearly drugged. Dr. Fleming had treated her for years. This wasn't dementia. This was poisoning. When he asked Dr. Porter what happened, Porter gave a rehearsed speech. He said she had declined rapidly, that her episodes had grown violent, that medication was the only way to calm her. But Dr. Fleming didn't buy it. He demanded to see the medical records. Margaret handed them over, records she had fabricated to justify Mrs. Whitfield's condition. But Dr. Fleming read them with a practiced eye and saw the lies. The symptoms didn't match. The drug dosages were too high. The treatment plan made no sense. What followed was a tense, one-hour confrontation in Dr. Porter's office. Fleming challenged every decision. He called out the inconsistencies. He demanded to know why no one had contacted Mrs. Whitfield's family. Dr. Porter stood his ground, acting insulted and self-righteous. He accused Fleming of being out of date, of not understanding modern medicine, of letting personal bias cloud his judgment.
And somehow, he held the line.
Ending music, slow haunting piano with a notice. Dr. Fleming left the home furious. He began drafting a report for the State Medical Board. But before he could file it, Mrs. Whitfield died in her sleep. Her death certificate was signed by Dr. Porter. No autopsy, no investigation. And her estate, rewritten just days before her death, leaving everything to the Sunset Years Christian Home. It would be decades before the truth came to light, but by then Mrs. Whitfield's name was written in the ledger beneath the floor. E. Whitfield, Initial resistance problematic, letters discovered, timeline accelerated, morphine-induced complications, estate secured $204,000, overall rating 6/10. Note, avoid future residents with writing habits. Closing narration, soft echo, echo, final line strong. The Porters had faced their greatest test yet, and once again they had gotten away with murder. But the mask was starting to slip, and somewhere in Hartford, someone else had begun to ask questions. Absolutely. Here's part 4 of your chilling historical horror story, written in a simple atmospheric style, tailored for a 20-minute American YouTube audience. This part focuses on the slow unraveling of the Porters' dark empire, where their past crimes begin to echo louder and cracks in their control grow more dangerous.
Opening music, slow minor piano theme. Distant wind howling to calm. By 1854,
The Sunset Years Christian home stood like a monument to Christian charity, its whitewashed walls, neat gardens and bell tower casting a long, saintly shadow over Hartford. But within those walls, the Porter family's mask was beginning to crack. They had murdered nearly 36 residents, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and perfected a system so coldly efficient that not one person had yet stopped them. Not one until now, because the death of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield had rattled the cage. She may not have survived, but her letters, her suspicions, and the confrontation with Dr. Fleming had left marks that wouldn't vanish. And this time people started noticing.
back quiet scribbling sound, distant murmur of voices.
In the months after Whitfield's death, staff members at the home began to quietly talk among themselves. Some couldn't shake what they'd seen, how Mrs. Whitfield went from alert to barely conscious in days. Others remembered the strange dosage logs, how medications were adjusted with no doctor's note. Nurse Abigail Dunn, one of the home's longest-serving employees, had always admired Margaret Porter. She believed in the mission, the prayers, the healing. But something had changed. One night, while reorganizing the medicine cabinet, she noticed a vial of morphine that was half empty, though the logbook said it was full. She flipped back through weeks of records. There were discrepancies, entries out of order, signs of tampering. Still unsure of what she'd found, she quietly removed one of the old patient files from the archive room, Mrs. Thornton's. It had always struck her how quickly the old woman had declined after seeming so healthy. The records didn't make sense. Symptoms were vague, dosages were high, and there was no second opinion listed anywhere. Abigail didn't know it yet, but she was the first person inside the home to begin piecing it together, and the Porters were watching. Music shifts to slower, darker tones like slow church bells echoing. Meanwhile, outside the home, Father O'Brien hadn't forgotten what the families had told him about sudden religious conversions and rewritten wills. He had already spoken once to the city council, but they'd brushed him off. Now he reached out to someone new.
Henry Clavell,
A retired judge known for investigating church corruption. Clavell was a man with time, reputation, and no fear of powerful names. Together, they began reviewing probate records tied to the Sunset Years Christian home. Over a dozen estates, all wealthy, all rerouted to the home. Most had no immediate heirs or relatives nearby, and strangely, most of the wills had been filed by Sarah Porter. That was their first real pattern. Then came the second. Dr. William Porter had personally signed nearly every death certificate tied to these estates. It was suspicious, but not yet criminal. They needed more.
scene change, parchment flipping, crow in background.
And they got it from the most unexpected place.
Nurse Abigail,
After months of growing suspicion, made a bold decision. Late one winter night, she snuck into the Porter's office and unlocked an old wooden filing drawer Sarah rarely opened. Inside, she found a small brass key unmarked. She didn't know what it opened, until a week later, while helping clean the attic storeroom, she found a loose floorboard tucked beneath old linens. She pried it up, and underneath was a wooden box, locked. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside were books, 23 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and brittle with time. Each one meticulously organised, each one a catalogue of death. Names, dates, symptoms. drugs administered, inheritance amounts, ratings, and chilling personal notes like subject responded poorly to laudanum, will forged. Nephew unlikely to contest. Sarah's performance in church afterward flawless. She closed the book, shaking, and she took 3 ledgers with her.
Cure!
Background, slow creaking door rising 2 nights later, Nurse Abigail vanished. She didn't resign, she didn't pack. She simply disappeared. Sarah Porter told the staff Abigail had suffered a mental breakdown and returned to her family in Massachusetts. But those who knew Abigail knew something was wrong. Her belongings were still in her room, and in the chapel, the prayer book she always carried was found lying open on the floor, pages torn, a note scrawled inside, "God sees, I hope someone else will too." It would be decades before the truth of Abigail's fate was uncovered.
Soft.
Ghostly piano melody begins, slow and cold. Still, the damage was done. Unknown to the Porters, Abigail had already mailed copies of the ledgers to Father O'Brien and Judge Clavell. And those 2 men were now certain they weren't looking at coincidence. They were looking at mass murder. But they had a problem. They had no surviving witness. And the city's elite still protected the Porters with blind loyalty. The church, the courts, the press, all of them saw the Sunset Years home as untouchable. So O'Brien and Clavell made a dangerous choice. They would wait, watch, gather more evidence, wait for the Porters to slip. And slip they would. Music darkens, grows tense, ticking clock builds quietly beneath. Because by 1856, cracks were showing in the Porters' perfect empire. Margaret had grown paranoid. She fired 2 nurses for disloyal behaviour. Sarah began forging documents sloppily, rushing deadlines. And Dr. Porter's entries in the ledgers became more erratic, more emotional. Voices in chapel during the night. Thought it was staff. Was alone. Patient called me by my brother's name. My brother died at sea. Margaret says it's guilt. I say it's warning. Something was shifting in the house. Visitors reported strange sights. Residents talking to empty chairs. Candles blowing out without wind. Objects moving. And then came the incident that would seal the Porter's fate.
Quiet pause, always.
Heartbeat sound fades in slowly. In 1857, a resident named Thomas Kinney, a former judge himself, died suddenly after only a few weeks at the home. But before his death, he had written a letter to his niece in Albany. "I fear I've made a mistake. There's something wrong here. The medicine clouds my thoughts. The prayers feel hollow. The doctor stares at me like a man reading a will." That letter, mailed before his final morphine dose, reached his niece the day of his funeral. And she wasn't like the others. She had money, she had lawyers, and she had questions. Closing music, dark strings. This time the questions wouldn't be ignored, and soon the walls of the Sunset Years Christian home would begin to crumble, because now the outside world was listening. And the voices of the dead were finally being heard.
Creation, soft and chilling town.
The Porters believed they had created the perfect crime, but they underestimated something stronger than fear: memory, faith, and the quiet persistence of the people they thought would stay silent. Here is the final part 5 of your story. The Sunset Years, a prayer before death, the final confession. This 20-minute conclusion wraps the chilling saga of the Porters and the Sunset Years Christian home in a simple, atmospheric, and deeply unsettling way, perfect for your American horror audience. Opening music, slow, solemn organ playing under a soft wind. By 1857, the foundations of the Sunset Years Christian home were crumbling, not just under the weight of suspicion, but under something much heavier: truth. The whispers that once echoed through its halls had grown into voices, and those voices were finally being heard. Sound, slow flipping of old papers, a pen scratching on parchment. When former Judge Thomas Kinney died under mysterious circumstances, his final letter, mailed to his niece, set a storm in motion. She hired investigators, she hired lawyers, and she did something no one else had dared to do. She challenged the will. The Hartford probate court was forced to examine the documents Sarah Porter had submitted. And for the first time in over a decade, someone noticed the handwriting didn't match. Music becomes tense. Soft ticking clock. The judge assigned to the case, Benjamin Ward, was known for being incorruptible. He began asking questions, he ordered medical records, he interviewed staff, and he subpoenaed financial documents from the Sunset Years home. That's when things began to unravel fast. One nurse, recently fired, agreed to speak anonymously. She mentioned how records were altered, medications doubled, and how Nurse Abigail Dunn had disappeared without a trace. Then came the real breakthrough. Judge Ward contacted Father O'Brien, who had been waiting nearly a decade for this moment. And what he handed over changed everything. 3 leather-bound ledgers mailed to him years earlier by Abigail Dunn before she vanished. Background: echo of church bells tolling. 1, 2. The ledgers contained everything. Each name, each dose, each amount stolen, and each murder. The court was stunned. The evidence was too detailed, too exact, too horrifying to dismiss. In early 1858, the Hartford police raided the Sunset Years Christian home. They arrested Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter. The home was shut down. The residents were relocated, and the papers across New England ran headlines that would haunt Connecticut forever. Christian home of death, 189 murdered, millions stolen. Quiet moment, fading heartbeat sound, voices whispering in background. During their interrogations, the Porters never confessed, not directly. Dr. Porter claimed the ledgers were hypothetical. Sarah insisted they were role-play case studies. Margaret wept, claimed innocence, but it didn't matter. The ledgers were enough. And in 1859, after a 6-month trial that drew national attention, the Porter family was found guilty of mass murder, fraud, and conspiracy. They were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge's closing words were simple: "You wore the cloth of angels while carrying out the work of devils." Dr. Porter died in prison 6 years later, reportedly still writing in notebooks, obsessively cataloguing imaginary patients and new methods of mercy killing. Margaret died in her cell in 1870, quietly, never speaking of the crimes again. But Sarah lived until 1895. By then, most had forgotten, but in her final weeks, she requested a priest. Not Father O'Brien, he had passed long before. A young visiting priest who kept a journal. According to his writings, Sarah confessed, but not the way you'd expect. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She said, "We were doing God's work. They were already forgotten by the world. We simply helped them move on. And the Lord, he rewarded us." Then, as the priest prayed beside her, she whispered one final sentence: "You don't understand. We weren't the only ones." She died that night, smiling. Background: cold wind, a door creaking open slowly. After the trial, the Sunset Years building sat empty for decades. No one wanted to touch it. Children threw stones at its windows. Teens dared each other to enter on Halloween. But in 1879, contractors were hired to renovate it into a public hospital. That's when the final horror was uncovered. Hidden beneath the medical wing, behind a sealed wall and under old floorboards, were the remaining 20 ledgers. Still dry, still preserved. One was open to a page titled "Final Report, Phase Complete, 189 subjects, method proven, no suspicion." Underneath, written in Dr. Porter's familiar cursive, just 3 words: "God is satisfied." Background music fades to silence, replaced by faint chapel bells and wind. They were never just caretakers. They were engineers of death, dressed in white linen and scripture. They created a machine of kindness and prayer, powered by suffering, and they almost got away with it. Today, nothing remains of the Sunset Years Christian home. The building was demolished in 1901. A park sits in its place, but those who visit late at night say you can still hear it. Prayers whispered by empty voices, footsteps on soft grass where no one walks, and the faint, aching cry of someone asking, "Is it time yet, Dr. Uzik?" Slow violin melody fading into Thank you for following this 5-part journey into one of America's most horrifying hidden histories. If you've stayed with us this long, you're one of the few who can handle the truth most turn away from. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. More stories are coming, And trust me, they only get darker.